And then finally, the part that I think is probably going to be the part that might need a little bit of massaging the most, and to be clear, we're holding a hearing here at the end of April, not because we intend to get a vote and throw this on a bunch of Senate bills in the next 2 weeks, but specifically because we would like to make sure that we get this language properly vetted. It's a complicated topic, and while we spent several hours going back and forth with each other and drafting, I'm quite sure we missed something and we'll need some assistance here. So recommendations for tweaks are welcome. But the final part here, to deal with specific circumstances like we've seen in some other states, where a child who has committed a crime, they have been convicted of that crime and declared delinquent, they are still provided firearms by their parent or guardian, and then subsequently are not supervised by said parent, and then they go off to commit another crime with that firearm. We believe that in those very narrow circumstances, the parent ought to be held responsible to some degree. Now, there's been talk, I know there's other bills that have been looked at to hold parents directly responsible for the crimes that their kids commit with guns. I think that's overboard. I think you do need to be responsible for your acts and your acts alone. At the same time, if you give a dangerous weapon to someone who has already been proven to be a danger to society and been convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, and that person is then left unsupervised with that weapon despite being under your exclusive care, and then that person then goes on to hurt someone, I do think you probably have to have some kind of consequence for that. So this is a starting point to have that discussion open, and I think that more or less covers this bill.
Okay, before we ask questions, I do have a couple of comments and a question of my own. First of all, I appreciate you tangling with what is obviously a very difficult subject. You both may recall that I had my own scuff marks as a result of last year's discussion. And I appreciate that a lot of the language here looks strikingly familiar to me, and I think it's generally well thought out. The difference between rural and urban use of firearms is a challenge to find something that bridges that gap without infringing on the Second Amendment. I would point out that sometimes we don't think about this. The Second Amendment protects our right to keep and bear arms. At no point does the Second Amendment protect our use of those firearms. If it did, there'd be no such thing as homicide. I think I appreciate your courage in tangling with a difficult subject, because it's within our own party that, frankly, we have the biggest challenge with that. I would ask that before we move too far forward, I'd like to talk with one or both of you about the idea of parental responsibility. There are other members of this committee who've had the same experience as I have, where you deal with a juvenile who is somewhat out of control, but particularly the male juvenile, who, frankly, his parents are afraid of him. And the ability for those parents to be able to control that young person's conduct can be very, very difficult. So I think if we're going to be adding some liability to the parents, we need to think about all the things we've done to restrict parents' ability to control their children. Because over the past 3 or 4 decades, we've watched parental authority being constantly eroded by a government who thinks they know more about parenting than the parent themselves. So I would encourage, I'd certainly like to join in on those conversations if we could have them.
We did take that. We did take that under consideration. That was one of our concerns. Do we overburden a parent's responsibility, or do we do it under a very narrow set of circumstances? And you can address that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I do completely agree. I think that we have to be real careful anytime that we're holding one person responsible for the actions of someone else that they may or may not actually be able to stop from committing that crime. The reason we structured it the way we did, and I do think there's some verbiage that needs to be changed to make it clear, because I've had several people read this language and read it incorrectly, so that's obviously our fault there. The intention is that they would have to take an affirmative act to provide the weapon to the child, knowing that they had been previously convicted, and then subsequently not monitor them. So any scenario in which a child may, say go into the cupboard and get the gun that the father has stored away, or any other situation where you might say, well, maybe the parent could have done more, but we don't necessarily know the circumstances, we're trying to make sure those types of situations would not be covered under this. They would have to take a direct affirmative act that is irresponsible in order to be covered under it. But I do think that should be tweaked a little bit to make that clear.
Okay, well, you obviously are cognizant of the things that would, I think, deserve some further attention, but I really like the spirit of this bill. It is a thorny topic, and speaking from personal experience, you may get a bruise or scuff mark of your own in the process here, but it's a battle worth waging, because we know there is a problem, and it's been just very difficult to find the bridge that allows us to deal with that without infringing on people's rights.